Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to see you, and thank you for coming to the Vail Symposium. I looked at the program of all your speakers and the topics that you cover, and I commend the committee for bringing that range of topics and the speakers here. You know, I can't help but think when Rich introduced me, emeritus here, emeritus there. Well, when I was up skiing today, and I had skied Vail, a number of times in the past, I think we can also now add skier emeritus. Let me just say, it ain't like it used to be, but it's still a lot of fun. So instead of symposium, I came to Vail to ski, and then some years later, I came to Vail because of one Robert W. Galvin, and his son Mike is still here. And so Bob used to invite me to what he called the skiing seminars. But this was a group of about a dozen people or so, and we'd cover every topic, essentially under the sun. So the topic I'm going to talk about today, and since you saw I'm associated with the Los Alamos National Laboratory, and I've been there off and on a long time. So I started there first, almost in another couple of months. It will be 60 years ago. So, oh God, right? That was a long time, right? So I went there as a summer student. I just finished my degree at Case Institute of Technology in Cleveland. And I got married and came to Los Alamos for my honeymoon and to work at this laboratory. So that was 60 years ago. So the topic I'm going to cover today is the nuclear world. So that's 80 years. How many of you saw the movie Oppenheimer? Oh, that's impressive. That Christopher Nolan knows how to make a movie. So that was 80 years, since Oppenheimer, and of course, the real birth of the nuclear age, with Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And so I look at myself today and I say, I've been here for 60 of those 80 years. And even though, as Rich had pointed out, I've moved on to Stanford. I spent 34 years at Los Alamos, 17 at Stanford. I retired from both places, and I'm now associated with Monterey and with Texas A&M University. So I've done 60 out of the 80 years, and so what I thought I would do is sort of take you through that, the nuclear era of those 80 years. But I'm going to do it from a personal perspective, and so this isn't just textbook. This is sort of my own journey through that nuclear world. And I'm going to start with the Oppenheimer movie. And as you remember, the Oppenheimer movie ends in apocalypse. So Oppenheimer goes to see Einstein at the Princeton Pond. Now it turns out that Nolan took some cinematic liberties. That didn't actually happen. He didn't go see Einstein at the pond. He went to see another great scientist, but nobody would know the other great scientist. Everybody knew Einstein. That guy was better than Einstein. You saw him, you knew that was Einstein. So he goes to see Einstein, and he says, Albert, do you remember when I came to see you because I was concerned, this is before they dropped the bombs, because I was concerned that the bombs are going to cause a chain reaction in the atmosphere and destroy the entire world. Albert stands there and he says, oh yes, of course. What of it? And Oppenheimer says, I believe we did. And then he shows the missile silos, the contrails of the missiles going off, and the world ending in a ring of fire. So that essentially was sort of the prediction of what was going to happen. It was what Oppenheimer was so concerned about. So why are we still here? I want you to think about that. Why are we still here? If that's what, this was 80 years ago. We didn't destroy the world. The apocalypse didn't happen. And so the reason we're still here, it didn't happen. And instead of what Oppenheimer was really concerned about, and that is the spread of nuclear weapons and then the exchange of nuclear weapons. And by the way, those weapons dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were tiny ones. I'll show you later. Those were the atomic bombs. That was before the hydrogen bombs. So it really was quite remarkable. And it didn't happen, and at least my version of this is instead sort of a global nuclear order evolved over time. Of course, there are lots of people out there who worried about getting annihilated. They said, what do you mean order? You know, I've been living on the brink. I'm concerned. But if you really step back, what I call the global nuclear order. So think about this, 1945, August 6th and 9th, Hiroshima, Nagasaki. No nuclear weapon has been used since that time. No nuclear weapon. That's pretty remarkable. Oppenheimer was concerned about the spread of nuclear weapons, you know, to everybody. Limited proliferation of nuclear weapons. So if you actually look at them today, there are less than 10 states that have nuclear weapons. Okay, not good that there are that many. They're not quite 10. But that's nowhere near as bad as they were expecting. And no nuclear terrorism. You know, with all the terrorism you've seen around the world, you still see today. Nobody has created a mushroom cloud from the terrorists. Not even a dirty bomb, which is just spreading radioactive dust, so to speak, all over. No nuclear terrorism. And then the good part is nuclear electricity. And that is to put essentially carbon-free electricity. And in this country, for a number of years, you know, we had almost 20% of our electricity was generated by nuclear power. And it doesn't create a lot of carbon. I'll talk about the downsides, you know, and the things we have to worry about. And of course, then there's nuclear medicine. You know, you go to take your MRI. Well, it turns out that's really nuclear magnetic resonance. And they decided not to put the word nuclear in because they were afraid people are going to be not using it. So it's a diagnostic treatment and all of those things that nuclear has brought. So that's what actually happened. So how did it happen? Well, it didn't just happen by itself. And so lots of things had to happen to fall in place that we're here. And then I'm going to wind it up to talk about, so where are we today? So let me actually, at this point, I should have started with this. In the back, could you raise your hand if you can hear me? Okay, so it's coming through well, okay. All right, so let's then move on and say, well, you know, that 1945, those two bombs in August, that changed the world forever. And the reason for that is what the scientists had done is they figured out how to liberate the energy of the nucleus. And the nucleus is this tiny, tiny little thing inside of the atom. Okay? They figured out how to split that nucleus to get millions of times the energy that you get when you burn coal. Even when you blow up TNT, those are all, they come from the electrons. Those are the things that circle around the nucleus. They give us all the things we're used to every day. It's splitting the nucleus that was different. And that's what they figured out how to do for the benefit, first of nuclear weapons and then of nuclear electricity. But anyway, so it was the factor of millions that changed the world. And Richard Rhodes, if you want to read one book about things nuclear going up the Manhattan Project, it is the best. unfortunate, it's about 1,000 pages, but it's really good. And so he actually said, mankind realized its own mortality when they saw that destruction. And indeed, Oppenheimer, that's the real Oppenheimer, he said the atomic bomb was the turn of the screw. It made the prospect of future war unendurable. It has led us up the last few steps to the mountain pass, and beyond, there was a different country. He said that in 1946. Well, it turns out, what I like to say, beyond Hiroshima and Nagasaki, there was a different world, not just a different country. So the best way to demonstrate that as to the effect that those two bombs had in 1945, so this is a chart that traces the number of people killed in war as a function of the different centuries. Okay, so you go back, in the 1500s, 1.5 million. Of course, there were also fewer people, but nevertheless. And then, as mankind developed better weapons, guess what we did? We killed each other better. That's what this curve shows. It's, the scientists, we call it an exponential growth. It just goes up. So it didn't matter what it was, the crossbow, everything as you went along, then finally used the airplanes. And so you get to the 20th century, and World War I, 20 million plus, World War II, more than 70 million plus. So you wind up, killing that many people, almost 90 million people in war. And it looked like it was going to go out. And that's what I mean. Why are we still around? If we'd followed that curve, it would be all over. But something happened. And that's what I say, the atomic bomb sort of caused this discontinuity in world affairs. And that's what's so dramatic. Now, it turns out we did figure out how to kill each other quite well. And in World War II, we had Dresden, Germany, firebombed by the Americans. Okay. We had Tokyo, March 9th and 10th, 1945, firebombed by the Americans. Wiped out Tokyo, 100,000 plus people killed. So what was so different about Hiroshima and Nagasaki to make it that different? Well, what was different was, essentially the simple way to put it is, it was one plane, one bomb, one city destroyed. That's what it was. That's the atomic bomb. The firebombing had 300-some B-29s. Thousands of bombs dropped. So it was totally different. That's what was so amazing. It was one bomb, one city destroyed. That's what made it so different. Okay, I was planning to bring this on a sheet of paper, and I forgot it because I like to read it. And so let me actually read it to you, because I've been teaching a lot, the 17 years at Stanford and now a couple of years since. And so I try to get the young people to understand what's so different about these nuclear weapons. And you can show them, we have videos, of atmospheric testing. And when you watch those videos, you see the destruction. It's enormous. But it's still, these days, there's so much of the stuff you see in the cinemas. Everything is being destroyed all the time. And so they don't really get the idea as to why are these things so different. What I use, and again I read it, is the account of an eyewitness, a survivor of the Nagasaki bombing. Dr. Akitsuki was his name. And what he said, the sky was dark as pitch, covered with dense clouds of smoke. Under that blackness, over the earth hung a yellow-brown fog. Gradually, the Vail ground became visible, and the view beyond rooted me to the spot with horror. All the buildings I could see were on fire. Trees on nearby hills were smoking, as were the leaves of sweet potatoes in the fields. To say that everything burned is not enough. The sky was dark, the ground was scarlet, and in between hung clouds of yellowish smoke. 3 kinds of color, black, yellow, scarlet, loomed ominously over the people. who ran about like so many ants seeking to escape that ocean of fire, that sky of smoke. It seemed like the end of the world. Every time I read that, it gives me the chills. That's captured what it's like. Okay, I've gone on too long for the introduction, but I did want to get across that these nuclear weapons are so devastating that it looks like we've at least got some semblance of saying, look, you know, we ought to do things a different way. So that's what I'm going to do. I mentioned the four things: nuclear weapons, proliferation, nuclear terrorism, peaceful nuclear energy. And then I do also have to cover what I call the battlefields of the Cold War. Because when you make all this nuclear stuff, as you might imagine, you have byproducts that often are quite dangerous. And that's what, you know, certainly we've had to deal with over the years. And I like to look at this, these 80 years at sort of three main periods. Again, this is my perspective. The Cold War, and I show Khrushchev banging his shoe at the United Nations, which he did, and he said, "We will bury you." Okay, so that was the Cold War. Then comes the post-Cold War, which, as I'll show, you know, was brought in by Gorbachev and Reagan. And then, wherever we are now, brought in by Putin and the invasion of Ukraine. Okay, so Hiroshima, Nagasaki, these were pretty simple bombs. Hiroshima was what we call the uranium bomb, Nagasaki a plutonium bomb. The Nagasaki bomb, the one that they showed in Oppenheimer, the scientists putting these explosive lenses around the core of plutonium in order to compress it fast to make it go boom. So that particular device was about this big. And so that's why it was in a B-29, you know, 10,000 kilograms. It was big. Then the scientists and the engineers and the technicians at Los Alamos, then over the next 10 years or so, look what they did. Instead that diameter, they reduced it by a factor of 3. The weight by a factor of 30. The reason for doing that, now you could put these things on a missile, you know, and you could fly it to the Soviet Union in 20-25 minutes instead of worrying about getting it over there with a bomber or so. So much more deadly. And then, you know, even though now we look at other countries that either have built nuclear weapons or want to build nuclear weapons or they want to test nuclear weapons, and we have all this uproar as to what they did, if you look back at the history of what we did, this was before my time, so I'm old, and I've been there at Los Alamos a long time, but not that long. So in that period of time, I mean, we had tactical missiles, nuclear depth charges that you drop down, artillery shells, backpack nukes. I mean, everything you can possibly imagine. I mean, the military just went nuts. And the guys at Los Alamos, the guys and gals, they said, oh yeah, we can make anything, and they did. So it was just amazing of what they did. So it was, I call it the Wild West of nuclear weapons development. And then in between, you saw Edward Teller in the movie Oppenheimer. Quite frank, he was a pain in the behind to Oppenheimer, as it turns out, because Oppenheimer, he's a very smart guy, needed him to do calculations, and all he wanted to do, he didn't want to work on these weapons. He wanted to work on what he called the super. And none of this splitting the nucleus to cause fission and the atomic bomb. Instead, fusing nuclei and creating fusion and really big bombs. Well, the Americans eventually did it. And in November 1st of 1952, they did this detonation. Now, just remember that Hiroshima was 15 kilotons, so 15,000-ton equivalent of high explosive. Nagasaki was 21. This was 10 megatons, million. So it was just enormously more powerful. And then we sort of settled down into what we call the triad. For those of you who pay attention to this, so the triad is you can deliver a nuclear weapon from the sea, submarine launched, missile, from air, land-launched missile, from the ground, air, and then from air, through a plane dropping it. So we developed all of those things at Los Alamos. So by this time I was there. And to do that, however, you can't just do that with computers and smart people. You got to test. You got to do experiments in the end. And again, this is, if you look at the way we worry about today, they have my book back there. I talk about the North Koreans having done 6 nuclear tests. We've been concerned about them doing a 7th. Well, the United States of America has done 1,054 nuclear tests. The Russians, Soviets are no slouches. They did 715. And so in the end, the Russians know just as much about nuclear weapons as we do. I'll mention later, it drops down quite a bit from there, although the French actually is the ones who stayed closest with 210. So the nuclear testing was a very important part, and I often give talks about nuclear testing history because it's really quite fascinating. But anyway, both the US and Soviets did a lot of tests. But in testing, early on, these were mostly atmospheric tests. And then there was this atmospheric test where we really got people's attention, actually got the public's attention. We, the scientists, again, before my time, we called it Castle Bravo. Every one of the nuclear tests had a name. And this one was 15 megatons. And the Los Alamos smart folks thought it was going to be 5 or 6. And it turns out there was a part of physics that they didn't understand until this thing blew up 3 times as much as what they expected. And so there happened to be a Japanese fishing vessel called the Lucky Dragon No. 5. I call it the Unlucky Dragon. It was 86 miles away, but then this thing blew up like that, and it rained radioactive dust all over that fishing vessel. Killed one pretty close, and then most of the rest had some sort of health problems from the nuclear fallout. And it's that test that really got the public involved. So for those of you old enough, you remember in the 1950s and 60s, you went to school and you had the duck and cover drills, or you'd go down in the basement because we were concerned about the Soviets coming this way. And then the public, there were protests about nuclear testing. So this really started the anti-nuclear movement as such because of the atmospheric testing. One of the things the US then did, as well the Russians also, is went underground. And so then for a while the tests were underground or atmospheric until later on we actually signed a treaty with the Soviets in 1963 to say, we can't test anywhere except underground. Because of this, the public is sort of uprising and saying, look, you just shouldn't do this. Okay, so these are a lot of words, and I'm not going to go in detail on any of these things. What I just want to do is to bring across, so this whole nuclear development was happening in a backdrop of 2 countries that were at loggerheads, the Soviet Union and the United States. And so there were lots of really difficult times. And some of my colleagues say we lived on the nuclear brink, through all of these. It turns out the Hungarian Revolution, that is something that I vividly remember because this was 1956. In 1956, I was a 13-year-old kid living in Austria. That's where I grew up. I'll explain later as to how that came to be. But anyway, so here I was in Austria, of Austrian parents, living in Austria, and I remember hearing the news that all these Hungarians were coming across the border because they were trying to get out of there. And in fact, many Hungarians came to the United States in 1956 because the Soviets crushed that revolution. The Berlin crisis, that wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis was very important. That was a nuclear crisis, 1962. Again, many of you with the gray hair will remember that. Those were really, really touchy times. Czechoslovakia was like the Hungary of 1968. Afghanistan, when they invaded that. And then things started to change. For example, in Poland, Lech Walesa stood up with his Solidarity Union. And then on the US side, let's just say we also weren't princes out there. If you look back, and I look back at some of this, and some of the things we did, quite frankly, you say, why in the world? For example, 1953, Iran was under the Shah. And they had a democratic movement that got elected and moved the Shah aside. So we went in and pushed the Democrat aside and put the Shah back in. In 1979, finally the Ayatollahs came and said, okay, the Shah is gone, he's out. And then you go back and forth from the things we've done in Latin America, in the Caribbean, Vietnam, that was during my time. I got a student deferment in 1965. And you have to ask, why in the world? Then, of course, our own internal turmoil. Don't forget Watergate. It was just amazing. Okay, so let me take you along now, and we'll get to the 1980s. So I was, by that time, as well established at Los Alamos. In comes President Ronald Reagan, and he gave his speech at the annual convention of the National Association of Evangelists, okay? And that's where he coined the term the evil empire. Okay, that was the Soviet Union. So I said, wow, God, things are really going to get tough now. He called these guys the evil empire. And then right after that, he gave what was called the Star Wars speech for SDI, Strategic Defense Initiative. And that was actually a very interesting thing where sort of Reagan's morality actually came through. At that time, deterrence worked. Deterrence was essentially the Americans threatened the Soviets. If you do anything, we're going to blow you up. Mutual assured destruction, because the Soviets would say, if you do anything, we're going to blow you up. So we better not launch these things at each other. And Reagan said, that's immoral. That's terrible. Why don't we just defend ourselves? With strategic defense. And then he had a few scientists, and you often get a few scientists who think they can do everything. In this case, it was Edward Teller, and said, oh yeah, we can put X-ray lasers into space, we can shoot everything down. Well, it turns out that wasn't really possible, but the idea was pretty good. Okay, so to summarize, so what happened during this time? So these are the number of nuclear weapons we were fielding at the time, all right? Now, I want you to look at the numbers here. This is 10,000. Okay, 20, 30, 40,000, up here. Incredible. And you can also see where the US was way ahead of the Soviets. We tested first in 45, they tested first in 1949, so they were, a bit behind us. And they were much slower in developing lots of nuclear weapons because they were destroyed during the Second World War. We were not, so we were much faster. And we were building them left and right. And so this was the arms race. In 1962 was this Cuban Missile Crisis. So as you look at that, you say, wow, we really were out there, and we're going to just wipe each other off the map. Then comes the same Reagan with the evil empire, and he sits down with Gorbachev in 1986. Again, so the personal part of that, for a number of reasons, I wound up as director of Los Alamos, as Rich said, the 5th director of Los Alamos, in January of 1986. And I look back now, I was still a young kid. I was 42 years old. I was director of Los Alamos. And in October of 1986, Reagan and Gorbachev get together in Reykjavik and they say, let's get rid of nuclear weapons. And I said, how's that for job security? They didn't have someone come in and wipe out a whole department of the government, as some are thinking about now. But instead, they didn't get rid of nuclear weapons. However, they actually had an agreement that there was another nuclear test ban treaty that was on the books that was not ratified by the Senate because we didn't trust the Soviets. We knew they were cheating, or at least that's what we said. And they figured, of course, we were cheating. So the two presidents actually said, hey, look, let's have the scientists develop capabilities to show that the other side is not cheating, to do it from a distance. And so I wound up in 1988 then, being director of Los Alamos, going out to Nevada. We're doing one of our tests. And I had to let the Soviets in to monitor our test. And I said, oh my God, we got one of the most sacred of all places, and we're going to bring the Soviets in. Well, it turns out it worked, and we ratified the treaty. Just to give you an indication of how different politically things are today. So after we developed all of these techniques to say, yes, we can ratify from a distance, the Senate ratified the treaty 98-0. Two of them weren't present at the time, so 98-0. All right. So then as we look back at those times, I can say deterrence somehow worked. But you have to remember, you can't just do deterrence, because deterrence is the threat, to the other side. You got to be able to threaten them, because otherwise they're not going to back off. But if you do that, then you've got the arms race forever, because you're just going to continue to make sure that you can threaten the other side more. So you have to bring in arms control to say, let's actually agree, hey, we don't want to have more than 10,000 nuclear weapons, or 5,000, or 1,000. And if we both agree, we can still kill each other, and deter each other. So those two have to work hand in hand. And indeed, to show you how big the nuclear business had come, then for reasons of Reagan and Gorbachev, making this agreement, as I'll show you in a few minutes, I wind up in Russia, okay? And here in this photo, do you see this big bomb? This guy, Yuri Trutnev, he was the designer of that big bomb, along with Andrei Sakharov, who later left their Los Alamos. This is in their Los Alamos Museum. Okay, that bomb is the one they tested in October of 1961, and the yield, the explosion, was 50 megatons, 50. And Sakharov didn't want Khrushchev to test it. Khrushchev says, you're a scientist, you stick to your science, I'll do the politics. But Sakharov convinced them to test it at half the yield. So this was 100 megaton bomb. Okay, so think about that, 100 megaton bomb. And then in Cuban Missile Crisis, where the Soviets had taken and put, nuclear missiles on Cuba. And of course, that was a short flight to the United States, and that was the Kennedy to Khrushchev showdown. So one of the things that I will try to make a point, that in the end, to get this global nuclear order takes cooperation. And it also takes good leadership. And so think about that. The president that has his finger on the nuclear button, by God, we hope he reacts like Kennedy did. And then actually also like Khrushchev, when Khrushchev backed down. If they hadn't backed down, indeed, my friend at Stanford, Bill Perry, who was Secretary of Defense, was actually there as an analyst of U-2 overflight data. He said, they asked me, this was October of 1962, to come back there and analyze the data. He said, I went back there. And every night I called my wife and I said, I may not call tomorrow because I think the world might end. And so this was really a scary time. Okay, so what then happens? So we got Reagan, Gorbachev getting together, and lo and behold, look at those curves that were going out of sight. They start to drop down. At the height of Soviet nuclear arsenal, 41,000. Okay, the US had 31,000, and then you can see the US curve in red sort of goes down, but it's not because we got soft. It is our missiles became more accurate, and we didn't need that many anymore. So we still had the same trade-off with each other. But you can see it went down. I show just my directorship at Los Alamos, these lines going up. So I could say, well, it was my fault, you know, that the nuclear weapons had gone down, but I don't want to claim that. But what I had to do is try to deal with that and what it actually means, and I'll just give you a bit of an example. But so what happened then in the summer of 1991 is, by that time, George H.W. Bush, one of the most underrated presidents ever in this country, in my opinion, he signed an agreement for actually reductions, not just limitations of nuclear weapons, with Gorbachev in July of 1991. So things look pretty good. Then, however, one of the other big scares, in the dog days of August 18 to 21, Gorbachev was there at his dacha, his vacation home away on the Crimea. And Soviet hardliners who didn't like this guy who was talking about perestroika restructuring and glasnost openness, they put him under house arrest and took away his nuclear suitcase. Those are the codes for launching the missiles. So Gorbachev was under house arrest. Fortunately, Boris Yeltsin, who's shown in the lower left, who was the president of the Russian Federation, you know, the Soviet Union was 15 republics. Boris Yeltsin stood up on the tank in Moscow, and they had made sure that they ended that putsch. Gorbachev, as I show on the lower right, was allowed to come back home, but his days were over. This was August of 1991. If we worry about statesmanship these days and what our leaders do, this is the example of one of the greatest, actually, examples of good statesmanship. Okay, the Soviet Union was apparently just going to come apart. Gorbachev is put under house arrest. He loses the nuclear suitcase, and President George H.W. Bush makes a phone call to Gorbachev. That's that September 27, says, "Hey, Mikhail, let me tell you what I'm about to do." And what he was about to do was to create a soft landing for the Soviet Union. He said, "I'm going to take all of our nuclear weapons off the surface ships, reduce the number of nuclear weapons, take them out of South Korea." We had nuclear weapons in South Korea. Do all of these things. Mikhail says to him, "You're going to do that unilaterally?" And Bush says, "Yes. But I would really appreciate if you would reciprocate." And so Gorbachev says, and for those of you, how many have traveled to Russia over the years? Okay, quite a few, then you know. So one of the most famous Russian phrases to me is, when Russians answer something, they say, "in principle." So Gorbachev said, "in principle, yes." And then he went on national television in the Soviet Union on the 5th, and he took all the similar steps. And that's when the Cold War was really turning down and ended. However, a couple of months later, the Soviet Union was gone. It dissolved on December 25th. And so Russia and the other 14 states. So, again, I was director at Los Alamos during that time. I have to go to Washington to make the parish calls, ask for money to support our programs and all of that. And the reception I got is to say, the Cold War is over. We're waiting to get the peace dividend. You guys don't need this much money anymore at Los Alamos. And I said, no, wait a minute. We have this country that had 41,000 nuclear weapons, and it's falling apart. It is absolutely falling apart, politically, economically, every which way. And at these two senators, and again, to show the contrast to today, and quite frankly, I must say, for the most part, disgusted with our Congress. These two, so on the left is Richard Lugar. He was from Indiana. He was the Republican. On the right is Sam Nunn. And they pointed out to say, hey, look, we've got loose nuke problems. You know, if this country comes apart, 41,000 nuclear weapons, what's going to happen to all of these? So I then changed that to loose nukes, loose nuclear materials, loose exports, and loose experts as such. And so then, what you had to get through your mind is before, during Cold War, we were threatened by the nuclear weapons in the hands of the Soviet government. Now we were threatened by nuclear weapons, materials, etc., getting out of the hands of the Soviet government and the other ones that had it. There were 4 of the republics that inherited the Soviet nuclear weapons, and that was Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. So that was sort of the clear and present danger at the time. And then that's where we techies and scientific people come in. So I went over to Russia, as I'll show you in a minute, to try to deal with this issue because it was huge. I told you, 40,000 plus nuclear weapons. Fissile material, so this is the plutonium, highly enriched uranium that I mentioned. So the plutonium in Nagasaki was around 6 kilograms. Okay, 6 kilograms, that's it. The highly enriched uranium, nowadays, you make a similar bomb, maybe 25 kilograms. That's all it takes. And the Russians had 1.4 million kilograms of that stuff spread over the 11 time zones of the Soviet Union, coming apart. Their workers not getting paid. And so that's when I go into our government to Secretary of Energy, Admiral James Watkins, and say, hey, look, this is a problem. Why don't we go over there and see what we can do to help them to take care of this problem? And so I did. I went over there. So the government approved this. I'm the guy on your right. And in the middle, the one I'm just about to shake hands with, is the guy we called the Russian Oppenheimer. So I never met the American Oppenheimer because he died in 1967. I'd only been there as a student in 65. When I came back in 68, he had already died. But I met the Russian Oppenheimer several times. And that started an effort of 20 years. We worked together with the Russians. And I've written that up in a book that I show here. It's called Doomed to Cooperate. If you don't cooperate, you're just doomed. And so that was the key part to help the Soviets get through and at the same time make sure that we don't have those problems. I also then later on, this was 1992, I took the same idea to China. And I've worked with the Chinese since that time. What we did, and this was just amazing, we went into their backyards to do scientific experiments, into their facilities. We worked together with them to do scientific experiments. And then we worked together as to how do we take care of the nuclear weapons? You know, how do we take care and make sure the nuclear materials are properly protected? So we worked together for 20 years in all of these territories that I mentioned. Weapons, materials, workers, infrastructure, etc. And so we moved from confrontation to cooperation. Probably the most significant cooperation we had was, our testing in the US was underground at Nevada. We first did some atmospheric tests at Nevada, and then we took them out to the Marshall Islands. That's where I showed you the unlucky dragon. Well, the Soviets, during their time, they did the testing also out back someplace. Our outback was Nevada at that time, and theirs was Semipalatinsk, which is in Kazakhstan. And I won't be able to describe this because there isn't anywhere near enough time, but just to say that the Russians had done tests at Semipalatinsk where they left stuff behind. Stuff meaning plutonium, highly enriched uranium. And so I went to my Russian colleagues and I said, hey, did you leave anything in Kazakhstan? It's now an independent country. They said, we're never going back. So I went there. Okay, this is the test site, the guard gate after the Soviet Union left. They pulled out their 20,000 soldiers. That's what was left. The copper cable thieves were making these ditches. And I was worried, in order to extract the copper cable to sell it to the Chinese. That's what they did, to make money. And I was worried, what's at the end of these copper cables? So we worked together for 10 years. This turned out at that time to be a super secret project. And it was United States hand in hand with the Russians and the Kazakhs. Fantastic story, written up by Washington Post journalist David Hoffman some years ago. He called it Plutonium Mountain. Okay, so as we look back now, especially with Putin having gone rogue 3 years ago, people could ask me, so you work with the Russians? And I did. By the way, I've been there 57 times. And so I work closely with the Russians. But since they've gone rogue, was it worth it? And I've had to answer that question in Congress, and I said, yeah, it was worth it. Because loose nukes, we were worried about that. There haven't been any, and they had tens of thousands. Loose nuclear materials, the bomb fuel, plutonium, highly enriched uranium. Very little got out during the time of turmoil in Russia. Experts, we were afraid they're going to sell, because these guys knew everything about bombs. They're going to sell that to Iran, to North Korea, to all the other places. Almost nothing. Actually, not any worse than the United States, because we have few renegades every now and then. And then exports, not bad. They send a few things to Iran that we were not happy about. But 30 years later, no nuclear disaster. That's why it was worth it. That's why you had to cooperate. Okay, so moving on, but then things changed. Take a look at their expressions. This is our man Obama, who was going to reach out his hands, to work with the other countries. And it's not our man Putin, it's their man Putin. And they're getting together in Ireland in June of 2013. And clearly they did not see eye to eye. And indeed, whereas we worked so closely with the Russians from 1992, 2007, things started to get a little dicier. By 2013 here, that was just the indication that, hey, things are going to be bad. By 2014, Putin invaded and took over Crimea and eastern Ukraine. So things went bad. In 2014, one of my 57 trips, I took this photo, that I found in Moscow on the side of one of the buildings, and it said, Crimea and Russia together forever. That's what the Russians felt they were getting back. Okay, then I'm going to go through this very quickly. You could say, all right, so that's US, Russia. What about the other countries? Well, Oppenheimer, right after the Manhattan Project, said, hey, look, we've got this problem, is the incentive for other countries to build a bomb is overwhelming. Once you demonstrated that capability, remember that curve of people killing each other, it's just going to be overwhelming. Second, the technologies necessary to build a bomb compared to peaceful use are for the most parts interchangeable and interdependent. So in other words, a dual use problem, which you can use for weapons, you can use for energy, or vice versa. So he said that's the problem. So the other countries then, as it turns out, so it was US followed by Soviet Union in 49, followed by the Brits in 52. And that's another fascinating story. The Brits were at Los Alamos during the Manhattan Project, helping us. And then we kicked them out and said, we're not going to share anything with you. So they said, okay, we'll build our own. And they did in 52 and tested it. France, which was never to be left behind, then tested in 1960. Then finally, the Chinese came around in 1964. So those are the it also turns out the 5 members of the National Security Council, so we call them the P5, they're the ones that have veto power. So those are now the recognized nuclear powers by this non-proliferation treaty, which in 1970 we agreed, and the other countries that signed this agreed, they would not develop nuclear weapons if we'd help them with peaceful nuclear energy. And then we said, these 5 said, and we'll get rid of ours in due time. You know, that due time hasn't quite come. So then the Indians, it turned out, did a test in 1974, which they said, oh, this was just a peaceful nuclear test. And it turns out, even though as funny as it might seem, the Soviet Union did 129 peaceful nuclear explosions, and we did a couple of dozen. You know, as you know, fracking is quite popular, right? You go down and you fracture the rock and so forth. This was nuclear fracking, for example, and things of that nature. Okay, so, but what Oppenheimer said, that other countries would be interested, yes, indeed, these are the countries that actually started a nuclear weapons program. Sweden and Switzerland, can you believe that? Yeah, they had a nuclear weapons program. Gave it up almost right away. Israel, I have a funny color. I have to explain that in a minute. So the other ones, you know, in the gray, Yugoslavia, South Korea, Japan, etc., they all started programs and gave them up. Okay? The ones in red, in India and Pakistan, I'll show you in a few minutes, they actually both developed nuclear weapons, and they have nuclear weapons today. North Korea, and that's in my book, so they developed nuclear weapons and they have them today. So the official 8 states in the world that have nuclear weapons are the P5 and India, Pakistan, and North Korea. South Africa, which is a fascinating case by itself, they actually built 6 nuclear weapons, and then they gave them up when they had the change of government from the white to the indigenous. Iraq and Libya, they tried, they never came close. Iran, again, I have a little different color, they're still at it, but they haven't decided yet. So the Israel case is, if you walk around, most knowledgeable people, you ask, does Israel have the bomb? They say, of course. If you ask me, I say, I don't know. And the reason I say that is I still have enough association with the US government that the official US government position is we do not know whether Israel has nuclear weapons or not, because that's what Israel says. And we back that. So there are books written on the nuclear weapons program in Israel, but we say we're not sure. So we have 8 nuclear powers, and then there's Israel. Okay, lot of words on this one. It's just to make the point that this non-proliferation means the lack of the spread of nuclear weapons takes an enormous, it's a regime. It takes countries working together, not just the P5, the nuclear weapons, but the other states. They, for example, like South Korea hasn't followed through with the nuclear weapon program because they have a security alliance with the United States. Japan hasn't built a bomb because they have a security alliance. The European Union and NATO has this special arrangement with the United States. You don't have each one of those states building nuclear weapons. It takes cooperation, it takes alliances. And you know, I've had such a difficult time getting people in the United States to understand we have alliances for a reason. We don't want all these countries to get the bomb because we're not going to have another 10 years without nuclear weapons use if we have a lot of states. So then it takes all these other things, international organizations, and detection, interdiction capabilities. That's where the techies all come in. So those are all important. So just, and you know, I could expound on any of these things. India and Pakistan, India started first with the peaceful nuclear explosion. They then in 1998, 24 years later, they actually blew up 5 of them and said, yeah, these were nuclear weapons tests. The Pakistanis, who had just been sitting by developing nuclear weapon program, were just waiting for the Indians to test. And when they did, Pakistanis tested 6. 1 for the one in 74 and the 5 they just did. So both of those are nuclear weapon states. In my opinion, even though they don't get much attention today, that's still the most dangerous nuclear place. Those two countries are at loggerheads, over Kashmir and other places. So that's dangerous. North Korea, I tell the story in the book. It's a sad, sad story of where they continued to press, and the US government, let's just say, missed every chance it ever had to try to come to some resolution. Iran, that story is not yet finished. They had nuclear weapons. The Shah had a nuclear weapons program. We built nuclear reactors for the Iranians under Shah. He wanted to keep his nuclear weapon program hidden from the United States, but then they threw him out. The Ayatollahs said, no, we can't have nuclear weapons. That's really immoral. But then they decided to go ahead and try to build them. And then there was a big agreement in the Obama administration with the Iranians to at least roll back the program, and then President Trump killed that program. And Netanyahu told them Iran lied. It does turn out they lied. But lots of countries lied in many ways. At any rate, they walked away. Okay, now again, just the quick nuclear terrorism. Look at George W. Bush's face. This was the moment he was told the first tower is coming down in Manhattan. And then just think if that would have been a nuclear bomb, or even had some plutonium, a dirty bomb. It would have been a different reason. So indeed, nuclear terrorism, you can have a detonation, that's a weapon of mass destruction. You can have a dirty bomb, that's mass disruption. Or you can blow up a nuclear power facility, and that's also radiation release. Obama really followed that on quite well. Nuclear power, we built nuclear reactors in the United States in the 50s, 1960s, into the 70s. We had the most nuclear reactors any place in the world. Then we had, as I'll show you in a second, 3 Mile Island, the radiation, slight radiation exposure from there. But you can see the countries, France actually got into it in a really big way, and they had the greatest percentage of nuclear electricity. So this thing was well underway, and then the 3 big nuclear accidents, 3 Mile Island, 79, Chernobyl, 1986, and then Japan in 2011. And so whatever we had of hopes of more nuclear power sort of died. But I'm sure as you read the papers today, there's all kinds of talk about nuclear power again. To a large extent, it's driven by the data centers because of artificial intelligence needs. And so we're right now in the middle of a nuclear renaissance. And the question is, can we actually pull it off? Because the United States, in all those years that it's done very little, has pretty much lost the capability to build a full nuclear reactor. So we're working on what we call small modular reactors. Okay, I'm sorry about the times. I'll try to run through this. So the battlefields. So everything about nuclear is not good. Of course, if you don't have deterrence, you have a nuclear war, that's really bad. But you also, uranium mining, that's dangerous stuff. Until recently, we've developed leaching techniques that's much safer. But you go to Grants, New Mexico, or the New Mexico-Arizona border, where we did much of the uranium mining, there are a lot of problems. Just like you mine coal, you got problems. Materials production in the complex, nuclear waste, what do you do with it? And then the testing was sort of the worst part of all of that, and the complexes grew. So I call those the battlefields of what's sort of left over. And the ones right now, the worst of those are up at Hanford with nuclear reactor waste. And we're still trying to deal with that, and it's very difficult. Savannah River in Georgia also has a lot of nuclear waste and nuclear facilities. Rocky Flats, I had discussions with my skiing colleagues today. That was one of the most notorious plutonium bomb factories, making the plutonium. So as dangerous as it might have been, this is a great nuclear story. We've cleaned that place up. It's now an environmental park. It has the greatest, wildlife in the Denver area there. And we did it smartly. But then nuclear testing legacy, and so there's a big cleanup legacy. So the nuclear order prevailed. As I said before, no nukes, limited proliferation of nuclear terrorism, and nuclear energy. And then comes Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin, and he invades Ukraine. Zaporizhia is one of the big power plants in Ukraine, and the Russians are forcing those operators to work at gunpoint. And so that's what I've been working on. How do we rebuild such a global nuclear order? It required cooperation, and Putin killed it. And he spelled it all out, and it's just amazing actually how clever he is. He planned this right from the beginning, that we are playing this bloody, dangerous game, and he's the guy who invaded. But most Americans think, well, it's not Putin. If we get rid of him, that solves the problem. It won't solve the problem. This was a pretty good colleague of mine on the Russian side, really great intellect. And he said, yeah, we can't trust the West. We ought to go bomb them. And we got to set the Americans back by striking nuclear in Europe. So this is, much, much more difficult. So that global nuclear order that I said, that required cooperation, it required good leadership in the country, and it required the rest of the world to work together to limit the spread of the nuclear bomb materials, etc. And to work together to put more nuclear power out there. It's fractured. And that invasion fractured it. Okay, so now I'm just about at the end. So you can say, well, what about China? Well, okay, China, it's a long story, but the short version of that, these are the number of nuclear weapons. Okay, this isn't 10,000 or so, this is 100, 200. So the Chinese, these were predictions here, you can't see that, predictions from our intel agents. They all thought the Chinese are going to go and build more and more nuclear weapons. They didn't until just about 2013. They only had a few hundred nuclear weapons. We had one time at 31,000. And so now they're building up. And what you read in the newspaper, unprecedented increase of nuclear weapons in modern times. So that's baloney. The unprecedented increase were in the United States in the 1950s and 60s. But they are building up. And so the Chinese have changed direction. They said for all those years we're going to pay attention to our economy, we're not going to put all our money in nuclear weapons. Well, now their economy is pretty good, so they're putting more money into nuclear weapons. And so now it really behooves us to learn to work with the Chinese. Okay, so I'm going to end on a philosophical note. I've mentioned that Robert W. Galvin, he was one of my heroes, the heroes of American industry. He was so good that I brought him to Los Alamos to help us, take a government-sponsored organization and try to make it more productive and more useful. And he came. And then that's how I got invited up here to the Vail seminars. So Bob Galvin, he's written a couple of books, one in the idea of ideas. He said this, he said, and think about this, my father gave me the most demanding gift of all. He trusted me. The most demanding gift of all. So I've stolen his. And I say, my country gave me the most demanding gift of all. It trusted me. Okay, think about this. I was born in Poland of Austrian parents. My mother had to take us to Slovenia to keep us away from the Russians, brought us into Austria proper, that I grew up until I was 13 years old, in old army barracks, no running water, no central heat, nothing. Came to the United States of America. I wasn't one of these gold card guys, that you want to attract. I was this 13-year-old kid from nothing, from nowhere. Came to the United States of America in 1956. A little over 5 years later, I got American citizenship. That citizenship allowed me to get a scholarship to go to Case Tech for a tuition of $1,400, by the way. And we couldn't have afforded the $1,400. So I got citizenship in 1962. I already mentioned in 1965, then I applied to Los Alamos, at that time Scientific Laboratory, for a summer job. But I needed a clearance, okay? A secret government clearance to go work at Los Alamos. Now here's this kid that just got his citizenship, was born in Poland. Not only that, but he was just about to marry a young lady who was Polish, who still had family back behind the Iron Curtain. I got a clearance. I got a job at Los Alamos. They trusted me to do that. Okay. Then 20 years later, by hook or crook, I became director of Los Alamos National Laboratory. They trusted me, to take the reins of a place that does lots of science, but also for nuclear weapons. And so that's the story I like to leave when we think today about immigration, about gold cards, or anything else. We've taken that away. Well, you get people like me, and since I told you, I had a draft deferment. I always felt guilty about that. But then I went and served, at Los Alamos for all of these years. It's because my country allowed me to do this. So we shouldn't lose track of that. It was the greatest country in the world. I happened to be here, it trusted me. And I hope I've taken good care of that trust. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Mr. Hecker, thank you so much for bringing your knowledge about the long history of America with nuclear weapons. We have a
speak up just for and for me.
We have a virtual Rotary Club called We Club of International Peace. One of our members is a Nobel Peace Prize winner, and he and another author of the book It Is Possible, which is about being able to non-nuclearize our country. They are just returning from New York City with the third session of the TPNW. What would you like me to share with them from your experience of how we could actually get across the finish line with no nuclear weapons?
Okay, so that will take a continued conversation, because most people don't know what the TPNW is, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So there have been many, movements towards getting rid of nuclear weapons in the world. And then this one managed to gather steam 5 or some years ago. And so most people would say, well, hey, look, that's a pretty good idea. And so my own view of that is, yeah, that's where we want to go. In the end, the Non-Proliferation Treaty says, the 5 countries that are allowed to have nuclear weapons, you're going to get rid of them. But it also has the words that in the spirit of general and complete disarmament. So the real question then always comes in, from my perspective, having watched this, so does disarmament and getting rid of nuclear weapons bring peace? Or does it take peace to bring disarmament? And that curve that I showed you of where nuclear weapons were going up and up and up, what brought the decrease was peace came first. And so we're not ready for peace. So I'm not in favor of TPNW, of the treaty at this time, because what it's done is the US, of course, has not signed. The P5, have not signed. Our allies, whether you're talking about Germany, South Korea, whatever, have not signed because they are sort of under our umbrella, right? And so what we've done now is really reinforce that there are these 2 different worlds. So they are non-nuclear weapon states, and they want these guys to get rid of the bombs. But then they're ones that have the bombs, and now they don't work together anymore. And so what the treaty brought is more of a polarization when I argue that, no, all those countries that don't have bombs, we need them in order not to have a nuclear catastrophe. We need them to not want to get nuclear weapons. We need them to worry about whether nuclear materials could be transported across their borders. We need them to be alert. We got to work together. So my whole pitch, for a number of years now has been, and that's why that book was called Doomed to Cooperate, is in the nuclear business, but you have to cooperate. And the treaty sort of took us in the wrong direction. We're going to fix it at some place along the line. And I'd be happy to follow up personally. You can get my email from Megan.
Given all the time you spent in the Soviet Union and Russia, what's your assessment of the risk that Putin will go across the bridge?
Yeah. So, will Putin use nuclear weapons? So in November of 2022, the Ukrainians were making major advances against the Russians. And it looked like the Russians were actually certainly very much in retreat. And that's where that concern was greatest. So if Putin is losing, would he come in with nuclear weapons? The Biden administration, and I work very closely with the Biden administration, by the way, I work very closely with the Trump administration, with the Bush administration, with the Obama administration. I'm a scientist, and I don't really care about the politics. I just want to make sure that we're still here when we're all done. And so the Biden administration, since they've now gone out, they actually said that they thought, National Security Council, there was a 50% chance that Putin's going to use nuclear weapons. 50% is way, way too high. Okay, so he didn't, and today the risks are much lower. But the point when I focus more on that part is he may not have used nuclear weapons, but he fractured that nuclear order. And so, for example, Ukraine gave up its Soviet nuclear weapons. You probably know that, in 1994. It inherited a couple of thousand nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union. It gave them back under the aegis of what's called the Budapest Memorandum that was signed in 1994, where Russian, American, and British leaders signed this memorandum to the Ukrainians to say, we will respect your sovereignty. Okay? We will not threaten you with nuclear weapons. And Putin tore that up. So what does that mean for the rest of the people who might be depending on security alliance? So he messed that up. They went into this nuclear power plant. They draped through the contaminated regions of Chernobyl also. That's state-sponsored nuclear terrorism. And they had actually moved themselves in a position where they were a very productive and useful part of global nuclear energy. And who in the world wants to buy their low-enriched uranium, when they do what they do now? Actually, the short answer is we, the Americans, our power companies are not willing to pay the big price, and so we're still buying, have been buying, Russian. But so he ruined all of that. So he may not have used nuclear weapons, but he fractured what I call the nuclear order. Very good question. Thank you.
To your right. I was wondering, there's been some talk about blowing up the nuclear equipment or, the plants in Iran. Is that a possibility in terms of, would you release a lot of problems into the air if you blew up these plants?
Yeah, so the question is, and you're obviously keeping up with the news as to what's happened with Iran, where the Israelis, in one of their counterstrikes to the Iran missile launches, there was a lot of discussion, should they actually try to take out the Iranian nuclear installations? My own view, when I was asked, I said, no, I wouldn't do that. If you take out their nuclear reactor, they have a power reactor built by the Russians, that would be a disaster. That would spread radioactivity all around. But that's not used for nuclear weapons. The sites that are used for nuclear weapons to enrich uranium, to take the uranium from ore to make it bomb grade, those, if you'd bomb them, they actually wouldn't release that much really harmful radiation, so it could be done. But the Israelis were much smarter than that. Instead of attacking those nuclear plants, they wiped out all of the defensive sites that the Iranians had for those plants. And so if they'd ever want to go back in, the Iranians have to rebuild their whole missile defense system. The Israelis wiped it out, and that was a really smart response. And the next time around, I guess I would also say, no, it's not worth to wipe out those facilities.
As an engineer, what do you think about the reliability of the current Russian, Soviet weapons that are left over? Do you think they would actually work? I mean, I understand how much our nuclear enterprise system costs. Do the Russians, have they been investing in maintaining their weapons?
So, let's see, the last part, are you saying, do the Russians have the capacity to make more nuclear weapons?
Have they been maintaining their inventory?
I'm sorry, have they?
Been maintaining their inventory?
Yeah.
Are they still potent?
No, it's a very good question. Actually, I've been asked that a couple of times. Because when the Russians first came across Ukraine, and it turned out they weren't 10 feet tall Russians, right? Their equipment was bad and all of a sudden. So people then ask, well, hey, look, if their conventional military was that bad, is the nuclear the same, right? Will it actually work, what they could do? So let me tell you, since I've been to Russia, mostly focused on nuclear, their nuclear weapons work. And so, yeah, the nuclear complex and what they call their strategic rocket forces is sort of set aside in Russia, and those guys are superb. So they're technically really superb. And a funny thing, actually, is I had some other photographs on here, if I didn't go on that long, to touch on the human dimensions of all these kind of interactions. In the end, you can do all the technical stuff, but they're human dimensions, the people. And it turns out the people in the Russian nuclear complex are superb people, not just technically, but as people as such. They're an important part of what I call the Russian civil society. So, yeah, their stuff works, and Putin and the Russian government, has figured out how important they are. And so, in the 90s, though, they, like everybody else, I would go to those cities, to their closed cities, that's like our Los Alamos, used to be. The scientists, technicians, etc., essentially had almost nothing to eat. They were not getting paid. And so I would ask them, I said, so how do you shop for anything? They said, well, the store owners give us credit for whatever little they have on the shelves. They give us credit in the hope that eventually we can be able to pay them back. And so the whole 1990s were like that for the Russians. And the fact that nothing went absolutely terribly wrong, a good part of that is actually what the Americans did. It was really important, and we worked with them closely. But the most important part was the Russians themselves. Their people, patriotic, and in Dostoevskian sense, willing to suffer. And they suffered, and they made it through those difficult times. But anyway, yeah, they can build more bombs. Actually, my biggest problem is with the Americans. We've lost most of what we used to have before 1990, because then this country wanted to collect the peace dividend. And quite frankly, we let things go to pots. So today you hear about all these modernization plans to spend, these trillions of dollars. Well, we have to make up for the fact that we let it go to pots. And now, we've got the Russians back, and so you got to worry about them. And yes, you have to worry about the Chinese. But, they're nowhere near to the level that we are in terms of number of nuclear weapons. Anyway.
Given the anticipated energy demands from data centers globally, what role do you think nuclear power should play, and then what would be the global security implications?
Megan, can you help me? I couldn't quite.
What role should nuclear energy play, and what are the global security
Okay.
implications?
Yeah. I admit I'm a great proponent of nuclear energy. So it has all of these enormous benefits. Just like for the bomb, it doesn't take much. But it has lots of downsides. And one of them is the global security, the proliferation issue. And we've struggled with that since the days of Oppenheimer, because that's why I showed the technologies, they're not exactly the same. You need the technologies you need for nuclear reactors, for bombs, but then you need more. And how you control that, and how you control the plutonium or highly enriched uranium that you would use for nuclear reactors, enriched uranium, or all reactors, it turns out, make plutonium. That's the byproduct of the reactor operating. How you manage that has really been the major challenge, related to nuclear power for all these years. In my opinion, all of those things are manageable, and we should do it. They're made a little bit easier and better if we go to these small modular reactors instead of the big ones, maybe about 1/10 the size of those big ones. You can make them safer. The most important problem with nuclear energy today is actually none of those things. What's the most important problem is it costs us too much to build these plants. So we've essentially wiped ourselves out, that it's become too expensive. And so they used to say in the 50s, in the heydays, nuclear energy is going to be too cheap to meter. Okay, that was the hope. Today there are people who say that nuclear energy is too expensive to matter. And so that's the problem. But all those things can be worked on, but again, it takes international cooperation. And so I've been a proponent of that cooperation in the nuclear energy field. So for example, today, the best reactor builders in the world are the South Koreans. They built 4 in the Middle East, and they actually managed to build those pretty much on time and within cost. We've only built 2 big nuclear reactors in the United States in the last 25 years, 2 in Georgia. They were, I think, altogether like 14 years late and more than 2 or 3 times as expensive as what they thought. And we don't know how to make the pressure vessels for those reactors anymore. We had to ask the South Koreans to make the pressure vessels. So that means you're all connected. You have to work together. And again, it's a story. Why do you need allies? Well, as great as we might be, it turns out we're actually not that great. We've lost a lot of our industrial capacity, and we need that cooperation. Anyway.
Sig, before we close, I wonder if you could give us a closing thought about why it's important for communities like ours to gather to hear information like this. Our country trusted you in that capacity. What role do we play?
So, actually, in terms of how you can be most effective, particularly in today's political environment where you've seen this enormous polarization between Democrats and Republicans, and any sort of sense of reason of the things that I'm talking about. Obviously, I made the point for allies, why you need to do all of these things. So the only hope that I have, and this is where these communities come in, we have to change Congress. We have to change Congress. And to change Congress, there are 2 senators per state, so you have the state, and then you have congressional districts. Those congressmen and women depend on you, on your views, on your votes. And so it's important for you to speak up. So for example, if you look at this and one says, hey, alliances aren't important, we go it alone. It's important for you to stand up with examples to say, hey, there was this guy Hecker, for example, who said, this stuff is really important in the nuclear arena. We can't go it alone. We're not as good as we think we are. Those are the people, the grassroots, and that's what you serve here. You bring speakers, obviously, with different points of view, and I don't care what the point of view is, but you ought to get involved, and then you ought to express that involvement and your opinion by voting. And to me, it's much more important these days who you vote for congressmen and women and senators, rather than, the big ticket. I hope that helps.
I assure you, you are more than some guy Hecker. Ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Siegfried Hecker.
Thank you.